Some angels you must wrestle with before they bless you, and poetry is often one of those angels. Most often, the difficulty of poetry arises from the expectations that we as readers bring to it. Verse poetry is very different from prose. Prose is the mode of everyday writing. You read it in novels, in newspapers, on signs, and it's a certain type of reading. It is not to say that poetry is better than prose, but it does acknowledge an essential difference between the two, that poetry is a special form of communication, and as such, poetry demands a special kind of reading. We don't read poetry the way we would read prose. And this is where the difficulty comes in, because we are an increasingly prose reading culture. Prose requires primarily the intellect. It wants to communicate or discover a message. But poetry requires the intellect to operate in harmony with other faculties of the mind and of the body, such as the imagination, our body's sense of rhythm, our appreciation of beauty, and our capacity for emotional and moral feeling. Poetry wants to discover the music of meaning, not just the message of meaning. As C.S. Lewis wrote in his Studies in Medieval and Renaissance Literature, there are moments in literary history at which to achieve a manner and a music is more important than to deliver any message, however profound or prophetic. The message can wait. It will have to wait forever unless the manner and music are found. Where prose cares about the message, poetry cares about the music, and I think this is something to keep in mind when reading any kind of poetry, and this will help with the difficulty. Poetry is the verbal record of human life and experience, governed into uniquely disciplined verbal events. T.S. Eliot was pressed once to define what verse poetry was, and he rather reluctantly gave a definition. He said, "Whatever else it may be, it is a system of punctuation in which language is ordered in a different way. Where and how the line of poetry ends, how it looks on the page, where the white space is operating with the text itself, how rhythms and sounds are ordered, all constitute a special system of punctuation." The poet Wordsworth once wrote in a letter that the success of a poem depends upon innumerable minutiae. That means that every single aspect of a poem contributes to its success. And that's something that makes it very different from prose. Everything matters. But the greatest things in life require labor. And for this reason, poetry is often difficult. But in this video, I'm going to give you 6 poets whose level of difficulty, I believe, is directly proportionate to their value. That means that these are not the most difficult poets of all time. If they were, I would have given you a different list, and Gertrude Stein would have been on there. But the most difficult poets here are those with the greatest return for your effort. And the first is Edmund Spenser. It may seem strange to find him on this list. After all, Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene was once a household title, and in an age before TV or radio, his epic poem was entertainment, moral instruction, and poetic inspiration all in one. That's why he's often called the poet's poet, because so many later writers admired him, and he inspired so much other poetry. But this also speaks to his difficulty for today's readers, and his star has fallen from many literature department curricula, because Spenser's, for some reason, it's just not taught as much as it used to be. But Spenser's descriptions are worth the trouble. They're just gorgeous. Here are 2 stanzas from a description of the Garden of Adonis, from The Faerie Queene, Book 3, Canto 6. "There is continual spring, and harvest there, continual, both meeting at one time. For both the boughs do laughing blossoms bear, and with fresh colours deck the wanton prime. And eke at once the heavy trees they climb, which seem to labour under their fruit's load. The whiles the joyous birds make their pastime amongst the shady leaves, their sweet abode, and their true loves without suspicion tell abroad. Right in the midset of that paradise there stood a stately mount, on whose round top a gloomy grove of myrtle trees did rise, whose shady boughs sharp steel did never lop, nor wicked beasts their tender buds did crop, but like a garland compassed the height, and from their fruitful sides sweet gum did drop, that all the ground with precious dew bedight, threw forth most dainty odors and most sweet delight. We can talk about the beauty of the Spenserian stanza, the lines here being iambic pentameter, and then ending with a line of iambic hexameter. But there's just such beauty here, especially the enactment of the continual meeting within the scheme. We have here what's called a panalepsis, the repetition of a word at the beginning and at the end of the line, and then also a type of chiasmus, we could say in these two lines. There is continual spring and harvest, there continual. You have the repetition of that, and it's just enforcing the sense of the continuation, the springtime and harvest cohabiting in one place, almost magically. And you see that happening there with the rhetorical schemes. But it's just a delicious description. Although, as you can see, the archaic spelling is difficult, and I think this is where it's going to give contemporary readers the most trouble. His archaic spelling is difficult. His dense allegory can be difficult because it will require a little bit of knowledge of history. And the Elizabethan style, much like Shakespeare's, can feel intimidating. Persist, however, and you'll find not only dazzling language such as this, but also a poet shaping English verse into something monumental. Once you read Spenser, you'll be able to hear him in the Romantics, in the 17th century, in the 18th century, even among some of the poets who are writing today. And he was strengthening the moral imagination with beauty in this poem. So my advice is this: read the poem, but with a visual imagination, an imagination like a screenplay. Imagine watching perhaps how it would look if this were cast on television. Employ the visual imagination to the max. Don't rush. Let the description get lost in this garden. Read slowly and allow yourself to hear the music of the verse. Keep a side-by-side edition with modernized spelling if you have to. Read cliff notes before each canto. That will help you keep track of what's going on in the narrative, but get lost in the beauty of the language, because that's what Spenser's all about. Remember that if you want to really understand the poem, allegory can be a key. Once you know that the Red Cross Knight represents holiness, Una represents truth, and so on, the narrative really opens up. And a guide such as a Cliff Notes guide will help with that. But really, what you want is not to substitute the reading experience with summary, but to allow the summary to enhance your actual imaginative encounter with the poetry, which is just beautiful in Spenser. Now the next poet is John Donne, and I might group along with him the whole metaphysical stylists. George Herbert, Andrew Marvell, Crashaw, these are all labeled metaphysical poets because of their intellectual strength. Samuel Johnson thought that their poetry was just showing off how much they know about all different subjects. In his Life of Cowley, he wrote that the metaphysical poets were men of learning, and to show their learning was their whole endeavor, meaning they just wanted to just kind of show off. But don't think of it as showing off, especially with Donne. Donne's poetry is the Renaissance lyric par excellence. His poetry yokes science and theology, and actually combines many subjects, not just science and theology, but eroticism, philosophy, esoteric philosophy, hermetic philosophy, Neoplatonist. And the joy of Donne is in his startling metaphors, something he calls, something critics call conceits. Donne can feel abrupt, argumentative, and strange, and his difficulty is in his brilliance. He asks us to hold together the sacred and the profane, the high and the low, the cosmic and the intimate, or the cosmic and the comic even, and often within the same line or poem. Reading Donne is like entering into a mind that refuses to simplify experience. He's encyclopedic. That's probably the best way to describe Donne in a word. Now, I said that the key to Donne is conceit. And I don't mean conceit in the negative way. Conceit, it comes from the root of our word concept. Conceit is an extended comparison between two seemingly dissimilar things, and Donne does this amazingly well. Donne usually yokes surprising things together in his conceits, and that's where his ingenuity and innovation lie. Don't expect Donne to be romantic, even in his love poetry, at least romantic in the sense of what we might understand that word by. Instead, look for the conceits, the startling comparisons. Ask what images are being put together. Ask what they illuminate about love, death, the soul, or faith. Circle key metaphors and map them out, and let the ingenuity just simply unfold in the reading. But take, for example, this passage from Donne's poem, A Valediction, forbidding mourning. Valediction is a saying farewell. And this is just the end of the poem. Think about, okay, so what images are being yoked together here? Our two souls, therefore, which are one, though I must go, endure not yet a breach, but an expansion, like gold to airy thinness beat. So there's one elemental metaphor. Even though I'm leaving you, we're still one. There's no breach, but we're just expanding wider. And this metaphor of expansion is going to be used again and developed further in this next paragraph. So first metaphor is with gold, beaten into gold leaf, which then allows the gold to be spread over a wider surface. But then this logical maneuver here. If they be two, they are two so as stiff twin compasses are two. Now a compass, here's a compass. It's like this. So he says, well, if we are two, and if we are not one, we are like this, where the soul, there's the fixed foot, which is on the paper, makes no show to move, but doth if the other do, which is this leg here, which roams. And though it in the center, this is how you make a circle, put that in the center, and though it in the center sit, yet when the other far doth roam, it leans and hearkens after it, and grows erect, as that comes home. So, coming home to the point, if you were to contract the circle, you see how straighter it's getting? That is the compass growing erect. And there also might be a bit of an erotic joke going on here. Such wilt thou be to me. So he's bringing the metaphor back home in this final stanza. Who must, like the other foot, obliquely run. Thy firmness makes my circle just, and makes me end where I begun. So here Donne compares the lovers to the legs of the compass in a wildly original metaphor. It's jarring at first, but as the development of the image unfolds here in these last three lines, gracefully, it acquires strength and actually becomes one of the most pleasing effects of his verse. So I think the pleasure of reading Donne, for me, is actually seldom the music in Donne's case, although he has great music sometimes, but rather in the intellectual satisfaction of pairing two very different images and ideas together. It's like a magic act, and there's something just so entertaining about it. So the third most difficult poet is William Blake. And I confess that for many years, Blake was impenetrable to me, even though I was endlessly fascinated by him ever since I was an undergraduate. My first paper in a Romanticist class was actually on Blake's Urizen, but I could not read him for more than an hour without my head spinning. And in each reading, the inner logic of his poetry constantly escaped me. There is a topsy-turviness to his poems, and you have to suspend a sort of orthodox understanding of heaven and hell, the spirit and the body, and to just kind of enter in and try to follow along with the inner spiritual logic by which his poems move. Just listen to this, for example, from his The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. By the way, this is the William Blake Archive, which is a fantastic, it's just a work of art, work of scholarly art, and it's all available for free, and you can read the poems as they're meant to be read. So, by the way, this passage is on the origin of the gods. Let me get to the origin of the gods. Here it is. The ancient poets animated all sensible objects with gods or geniuses, calling them by the names and adorning them with the properties of woods, rivers, mountains, lakes, cities, nations, and whatever their enlarged and numerous senses could perceive. And particularly, they studied the genius of each city and country, placing it under its mental deity, till a system was formed, which some took advantage of and enslaved the vulgar by attempting to realize or abstract the mental deities from their objects. Thus began priesthood. So he's talking about how religion began. Choosing forms of worship from poetic tales, and at length they pronounced that the gods had ordered such things. Thus men forgot that all deities reside in the human breast. Okay, this is a pretty straightforward passage. It's prose poetry, but it's also mixing in with the imagery here. So my advice is to approach Blake as if you're interpreting a dream. I think people who deal with symbols, people who are familiar with dream interpretation or reading tarot cards or studying biblical types or having studied esotericism or alchemy or Jung's archetypes have an advantage over anyone else when it comes to reading Blake, because such practices require interpretation of both word and image. Don't worry about decoding everything on the first pass. Read in small doses and let the strangeness wash over you. Blake was also a painter, as you can see here. These are his images, these copperplate etchings, and they can help you make sense of the meaning. This is how the poem was meant to be experienced with the text. And look, if you click on the magnify button here, they have this beautiful feature. You can zoom in. So here are the gods. Here looks like a spirit of the woods or of the earth, a genus loci. Here is very clearly a spirit of the water, looking down upon a human child, it looks, who has its arms outstretched to receive the beatific vision of this spiritual person. This perhaps is the growing intellect. And then all throughout the text, you have these moments where you have these birds, these animals in the text itself. Look at that. And they can actually help you. So when it gets down to talking about the development of the priesthood, we see these forms, human bodies subjugated in these bodily postures of either prayer or worship, something set up there. And then down below, we have these gods, it appears, beneath, in the darkness, at the bottom of the page. So this is representing how the deities have been kind of suppressed by the priesthood, whereas here in the beginning they were in this very atavistic and beautiful setting. So the key there is the imagery, and you want to experience William Blake this way. Now the next difficult poet is Wallace Stevens. Wallace Stevens was born 1879, lived to 1955, and he was an insurance executive by day and a poet by night. For all of you poets out there working full-time jobs in the world and producing beautiful art in your downtime, Stevens is your encouragement. Not many poets, until our own moment, went to MFA programs to be made poets. Most of them were self-taught. Not that there's anything wrong with MFA programs, but Stevens wrote some of the most beautiful, philosophically demanding poetry of the 20th century. As an insurance executive, he meditates on the act of meaning-making. His poems are these reflections on how we make sense of our world. And that's why his poetry can be difficult. His poems are lush with images and abstract in their logic. Take, for example, his poem Anecdote of the Jar. This is from his first volume of poetry, Harmonium, which was published in 1923. I placed a jar in Tennessee, and round it was, upon a hill. It made the slovenly wilderness around that hill. The wilderness rose up to it, and sprawled around, no longer wild. The jar was round upon the ground, and tall, and of a port in air. It took dominion everywhere. The jar was grey and bare. It did not give of bird or bush like nothing else in Tennessee. This is a poem about, among other things, the activity of the human subjectivity in the imagination represented in miniature. In a way, you can't really speak of the jar as a symbol because it very clearly has its own objective autonomy here. It's its own thing. Isn't it also a symbol of the human mind? Is not your mind a little jar placed upon a hill that subjugates all that surrounds it to its own center? Stevens' central drama in much of his poetry lies between the brute fact of the world and the shaping power of the imagination. Reality is often stark, even bare. Imagination invests it with grandeur, almost tames it, we might say. David Perkins put it really well when he said that while other modernist poetry was interested in image and metaphor, the poetry of Stevens was an escape into fantasy that lifted the pressure of reality while also highlighting reality in some aspects. And that's from Perkins' beautiful 2-volume collection on the study of modernism, which I recommended in an earlier video. My advice, if you're going to read Wallace Stevens, is to accept the difficulty as essential and not accidental. That is, you must understand that the difficulty of his poems may not come so much from your ignorance, but from the poems themselves, as important features of the poems that contribute to their success. It's demanding. Let me put it this way. When we come to poetry with certain expectations, that it should say, as most poetry does, stir our emotions, or that it should speak of nature and of flowers, that it should speak of human beings and of human life and the human heart, that may throw us off with Stevens. Stevens's poetry gives us something different. He's philosophical, intellectual. He's very much like the metaphysical poets, the school of the metaphysical poets with John Donne. I would say he's a metaphysical poet without the metaphysics. There's a paradox there, and that's part of Stevens. There is an obliquity to his poetry, as some critics have called it, a difficulty. Yet Stevens rewards patience with deep reflections on how we live and perceive, how we make meaning. And if you've ever wondered how art itself helps us bear existence, bear reality, Stevens is your poet. Now, number 5 is Marianne Moore. She was born in 1887, died in 1972, so she's also in the modernist school. Here, her poetry is a strange blend of the whimsical and the precise, exacting eye of a naturalist. She's witty, and she's very idiosyncratic, both in her person and in her poetry, and her poems often quote from unlikely sources. It's documentary in that way. She'll pull things from objects or things she sees, random documents even, such as manuals, newspapers, travel guides, receipts, and she weaves them into intricate verse. A good example of that is her poem, No Swan So Fine. Here we are from the Poetry Foundation website. No water so still as the dead fountains of Versailles. No swan, with swart, blind look askance and ambidextrous legs, so fine as the chintz china, one with fawn brown eyes, and toothed gold collar on to show whose bird it was, lodged in the Louis XV candelabrum tree of coxcomb-tinted buttons, dahlias, sea urchins, and everlastings. It perches on the branching foam of polished, sculptured flowers, at ease and tall. The king is dead. And this fantastic poem, you can see how the shape of it, the visual icon of the poem itself is, of course, part of the poetry. It's not something just heard, it's something also read from the page in the visual encounter with the poem. Even where these dashes come in, where the words are incompleted, something characteristic of Moore, is very much informing the poem. It's very much a part of the poet and its experience. This one was inspired by Louis XV's porcelain swan centerpiece, which was in a collection near Paris. The piece is ornately decorated in Rococo style. It is lavish, aristocratic. It's fine, as she describes. It's fine in the extreme. Moore often built poems around objects she had seen in museums. This is called a certain type of poetry that's called ekphrastic poetry. She also builds them around ideas she finds in encyclopedias and in exhibition catalogs. Really, anything of the daily life is fair game. So the poem has its roots in visual art and the culture of European aristocracy, refracted through Moore's sharp eye for detail, as we see here. Notice her syllabic form. Count the syllables per line, and you'll see her discipline. She's great with syllabic form. Don't be put off by the factual style, the very documentary style. Instead, think of her as a curator who carefully arranges details to reveal hidden patterns of truth, hidden sensations and encounters with objects through the sight, and then mediated through language. My advice when reading Moore, I think the key to enjoying Moore's poetry is possessing a keen interest in animals and things, especially the life of things, we might call it. Listen to her poetry and read it aloud, and listen to yourself reading it aloud, and allow your imagination to move with the sound. She was a master of syllabic verse, which gave her poems a distinctive rhythm. So there's music there too. At first, her work may seem fragmented or overly intellectual. You might feel like you're not getting anything out of it. You might feel like you're not really getting it, like it's trying to tell you something. You don't know what it's trying to tell you. But with time, I think, and with patience, the meaning and the music both appear, often together, and her subtle humor and vision, her perspective, emerge slowly. She teaches us to see the extraordinary in the ordinary with unmatched precision. And in a way, in that respect, she's like Elizabeth Bishop. Finally, the last poet on this list is Hart Crane. Crane's verse is a symphony of poetry. His great work, he has several great works, The Bridge, but the one I'd recommend starting with is Voyages. Why is Hart Crane on this list? I think it's because his syntax is complicated. It's very naughty. It can be difficult to untangle. His images are very densely layered. And Marion Moore, by the way, often quibbled with it. She was the editor of The Dial, to which Crane submitted several of his poems. She often rejected his poems, but if she didn't reject it outright, she would often send the poems back heavily revised and annotated, which annoyed Crane. But reading Crane is it's like swimming along an ocean shore where the breakers are actually quite disruptive to an even rhythm of swimming. You don't get a sort of swimmer's cadence there. It's constantly kind of being overwhelmed by something coming at it. And his vision of poetry, it really helps us here. He sees poetry as the vessel of transcendence that makes him one of the boldest voices in American letters, especially among the American modernist poets. Take, for example, this beautiful transition between the first section of Voyages and the second. Oh, brilliant kids, frisk with your dog, fondle your shells and sticks, bleached by time and the elements. But there is a line you must not cross, nor ever trust beyond it. Spry cordage of your bodies to caresses, too liken faithful from too wide a breast. The bottom of the sea is cruel. This is the transition into part 2. And yet, this great wink of eternity, of rimless floods, unfettered leewardings, semite sheeted, and processioned where her undinal vast belly moonward bends, laughing the rapt inflections of our love. Take this sea, whose diapason knells on scrolls of silver snowy sentences, the sceptred terror of whose sessions rends as her demeanor's motion well or ill, all but the pieties of lovers' hands. So you can see what I mean about the dense syntax, and the metaphors accumulate, they pile up on each other, and his diction is elevated to the point sometimes of overwhelm. But that's the beauty of it. So my advice with Hart Crane is to treat Crane's poetry like music. Don't panic if you don't follow every image. In his essay titled General Aim and Theories, he tells us how the poetry works. So let me read you just this brief passage from the essay, because he gives good advice for reading his own poetry here. It is as though a poem gave the reader, as he left it, a single new word, never before spoken, and impossible to actually enunciate, but self-evident as an active principle in the reader's consciousness henceforward. The motion of the poem must be derived from the implicit emotional dynamics of the materials used, and the terms of expression employed are often selected less for their logical, that is, literal significance, than for their associational meanings. So you see how prose logic, when reading poetry, reading Crane's poetry especially, will actually sometimes lead you astray. Via this and their metaphorical interrelationships, there's the associational meaning here, the entire construction of the poem is raised on the organic principle of a logic of metaphor, which antedates our so-called pure logic. So he's saying there's a logic of metaphor, of association, which is older than our very analytical or scientific modes of intellectual logic, and which, in this logic of metaphor, which is the genetic basis of all speech, hence consciousness and thought extension. The poetry for Hart Crane is actually going back to the origins of language. And that's what's so fascinating about it. He's getting back to what language was before it became prose. And the logic of his poetry moves according to that logic of metaphor. So you must suspend your intellectual logic and intuit higher laws of logic, such as the logic of metaphor, which only have their full effect in the logic of music. Those metaphors will only have the full effect there. Read aloud. Again, hear the rhythms and allow emotion to guide you before meaning does. Over time, the larger themes will emerge from the poem. And so patience is really the advice I'd give for reading all of these poems. Now, despite what the title of this video may suggest, this video is meant to encourage you. Any one of you watching this video can find difficult poets worth reading and perhaps even discover a new love in a difficult poet. And I also believe that each of you have not only the ability to become great readers of great poets, but can also contribute to the collective understanding of the great poets. Many of you have a knowledge of life and have experience that many academics do not have. And in that respect, many have more in common with the poets than the scholars themselves. And vice versa, academics have other forms of knowledge that can help understanding and appreciating poetry. The point is, we need each other to widen the circumference of our collective knowledge. And I think that's something really beautiful that I find happening in the comment sections of these videos. So I hope you'll find the difficult poets worth reading. Thanks for watching, and until next time.